giants his first time on the battlefield and thousands of enemies that he should be brought down by a woman. He faced the most terrifying things imaginable and lived in constant fear for his life while fleeing from the wrath of King Saul. But in a period of safety, security, and luxury, he falls victim to the temptations of lust. Now, I don't want to be one of those preachers that spends all of his time harping on sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Because I think there are some bigger issues that we face in the world today. But if we were to draw parallels between David's life and where we are right now, most certainly this is a time of security for most of us. This is a time of luxury for most of us. It's a time of leisure. And if we understand anything from the way the enemy of our souls work, then we should be on guard. Warning signs. You are never too big to fail. Now that may be true of GM. That may be true of Dow Chemical. It may be true of the U.S. government. But you are never too big to fail. You're never so spiritual that you can become careless about sin. Never so strong and mature that you can play with temptation. Well, I'm just going to toy with it. It won't get me. Anyone can fall victim to it. If David, the man after God's own heart, could sink so low, then the rest of us should be extra careful. What I want us to see this morning is the warning signs that you might be headed for trouble. And take action to get back on a safe track. How to identify dangerous situations. Things that you can do to keep yourself safe. This was an entirely unnecessary situation. It didn't have to happen. And it would have saved David a lifetime of trouble if it didn't. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 5. Please follow along as I read aloud. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. And David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, "I am pregnant." Some important things to remember here this morning. Maybe you've heard them before, but I think it would be good for us to hear them again. If you're looking at your notes, I'm going to keep this very simple because our time is short. Number one, anyone can fall into temptation. Anyone. Anyone. Just think of all the spiritual giants that messed up because they didn't take this warning seriously. Perhaps not the temptation of lust, but perhaps the temptation to carelessness and drunkenness. What about Noah? The man who rescued the human race, as it were, by building an ark after God's design and literally riding out the storm. Only to fall victim to drunkenness, to bring shame on his entire family. What about Abraham, the father of the faithful? If only he had listened to God's word, God's very clear instructions that God would give him a son, but he had to meddle with it. If only we would have claimed God's promise that he would protect him and keep him safe. If only he had believed it and not given his wife to another man. We could go on. Moses, if he had trusted God to supply his needs. Elijah, Peter. The list literally is endless, isn't it? Just think about all the spiritual giants of our time that have fallen to this particular sin. All the ministry leaders that have had their reputations destroyed because of the temptation of lust. Some names come immediately to mind, and I mention them only because in years past they've been plastered all over the news. Jim Bakker, Jimmy Swaggart, Ted Haggart. We could go on and on. Like David, they didn't take the danger seriously. They played with temptation, and they got burned. Fortunately, this never happened to Billy Graham. And he's one that we like to point out because he illustrates this point so beautifully. If anyone could fall into temptation, then all of us should take extra steps to make sure we're safe. And that's exactly what Billy Graham did. From the earliest days of his evangelistic foundation, they had a written policy that Billy Graham would never enter a hotel room unless it was checked to be empty first. Not that Billy was setting women up to meet him after a crusade, but to make sure that nobody set him up. He brought others on board to keep him safe. You know, there was a time in my life when I thought it would be wonderful if I could live in a town where I didn't go to church with anyone. Because then maybe I could do some things that I knew I shouldn't do and nobody would find out about it. Like water skiing on Sunday. Where's Brother Craig? Oh, wouldn't that be wonderful? Or I could skip church and nobody would see me, at the park and instead of at church. I could go to the movie theater and nobody would see my car in the parking lot. Wouldn't that be wonderful? It's kind of the idea, that slogan that's become so popular today. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What's the promise here? Well, if you go to Vegas, you can do whatever you want, and nobody will find out about it. I'm a little older now. Can I tell you my perspective? I'm living in the town where I go to church, and living in the town where I'm also the pastor. I no longer look at that as a drawback. I consider it to be a wonderful safety net. It's a reminder of what I should be, what I really want to be. These people aren't here to keep me from doing what I want to do, to spoil my fun. They're a God-given blessing to protect me from what would destroy me. Anyone can fall into temptation. Second point here, there's no such thing as a harmless sin. No such thing as a harmless sin, especially a sexual sin. The Bible has a lot to say on this topic because it is a powerful temptation. Now, hopefully I'm not telling you something that you didn't already know. We know in our world today that the sex is used to sell everything from toothpaste to sports cars. I mean, it's all around us. And the reason for that is because God has given us a strong sex drive. He's done that to make our marriage relationships deep and intimate. But it's also a drive that's hard to resist. And that's why it's perfect for selling events. Marketing executives know this. And so does the enemy of our souls. Because it is so sacred and special, Satan loves to pervert and attack it. And sitting in this area, of course, has disastrous consequences. Now, if you're here this morning and you've failed in this arena of life, our goal here is not to poke fun at you. Not to get out the scarlet letters and paint people as they leave. That's not our point. But I would go so far to say is if you've made an error in this area of your life, if you've failed in this arena of temptation, my guess is that if you could do so safely, you'd love to stand up here with me and say exactly what I'm saying to everyone else. Don't let this happen to you. 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 18 says, "Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside his body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body." It has disastrous consequences for who we are as people. It damages you. It destroys relationships. It can take away your happiness, ruin your future, not to mention what it does to others. Some time ago, Brother Jim DeWald told me about some training he had with a company you worked for. I think it was with electricians. And they sat people down, and as they were starting, and these technicians would be sent into people's homes and work on things, that they brought up the area of this particular type of temptation. And they talked to these employees and said, "You will lose your house, your car, all your possessions, your job, if you give in to this temptation." In other words, be warned, you could lose it all. Most certainly was the case for David. So anyone can fall into temptation. There's no such thing as a harmless sin. And then I want you to see here, recognize the warning signs of a dangerous situation. This is a temptation even the strongest Christians have difficulty resisting. That's why we bring up these famous preachers. It's not because they're stronger or weaker than anyone else, but because all of us have a weakness in this area. So the key to success is not figuring out how to become strong enough to resist it. I'm not suggesting to you this morning that as a church we should all go out to the beach on Bikini Sunday and all practice resisting temptation, that this will never happen to us. Somebody say amen, preacher. All right? That's not the point here. I'm not suggesting that we attempt to become stronger so that we can resist it. I'm saying we should listen to Scripture. What does it say? Flee from sexual temptation. Flee from it. Avoid it altogether. Don't play with it. Is there an attractive woman in the workplace? What does it mean that you flirt with her as much as you can without getting into trouble? That's not fleeing. Don't set yourself up. Recognize the warning signs that you might be headed into trouble. I've listed some of those for you here because the text spells them out for us. David should have known better. Number one, he was self-confident. I mean, consider what had happened in David's life. It seemed like the worst was behind him. The greatest challenges he could face were over and done with. Now he was finally safe. He killed all the giants. He'd eliminated his enemies. He'd overcome King Saul. He'd become king of the nation. He'd been crowned by all the people. Everyone had paid homage to him. He had conquered Jerusalem and made it his capital. And in the text here, we see that he even had his own palace in the city. I mean, what's left to do at this point? but sit back and enjoy the good life. May I suggest to us this morning that this quite often is what gets us into trouble? We become self-confident and we say, well, the battle for us is over, right? I mean, there's no longer any temptation. I don't have to worry about fighting the battle with sin. I mean, look where we're at. We've got new carpet. We've got a roof over our heads. We've been going to this church forever. There's no longer any problems. And so there's no temptation in our church at all, right? Every one of you are just gliding towards heaven at this point. No trouble at all. It's not true, is it? Quite often, this is the most dangerous time. You say, well, Pastor, I don't like that. I thought I went through all the challenges so I could finally take it easy. Well, it doesn't work that way in this life. We need to be vigilant and be on guard. For some of you, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this. You're getting close to the finish line. How's that? Is that a good way to say it? You're getting close to the finish line. If you think of life as a race, you know, I used to like joking with Harry about waitresses at restaurants, and he says, you know why the women like me? I said, no, Harry, why is that? He says, because I'm harmless. We have a good laugh about that. If you're getting close to the finish line, now is not the time to become careless. Now is not the time to become crotchety. Now is not the time to ruin everything that you've run for to this point. It's not the time to become stubborn and belligerent and ruin the reward that you've stored up. If there was a point in your life where you were on fire for God, it should be 5 times that, 100 times that now. You see, there's not some point in life where we're entitled to become selfish. None of us. And for David, it was the first step towards sliding into danger. Second one here, he was disobedient. Why do you say that, Pastor? Because it doesn't say that anywhere in the text. Yes, it does. Verse 1, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war. Who was king of Israel? David. So who went off to war? It tells us. David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. But David stayed in Jerusalem. The springtime is when kings make war, but David didn't make war. He didn't lead God's people. He sent someone else to do the Lord's work. Do you want to know when you're in a prime position to get into trouble? When you suddenly come to the conclusion that God's work is somebody else's job. And we've got all kinds of ways to explain it away why it's not our problem. Well, I've already did my part. David killed giants, David killed enemies, David conquered Jerusalem. Maybe that was the conclusion he came to. Now it's somebody else's job. Well, if you're not doing God's work, whose work are you doing? The devil's work. Or you're in a prime position to do the devil's work. David didn't go off to war and set himself up for trouble. He was idle. What was David doing in Jerusalem? Apparently he was laying around his palace. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, why was David getting up in the middle of the night? Or at least after dark. Apparently he was in bed and got out of bed. Do you know why this happens? I'm not trying to make too big of a deal out of it, but the text tells us. Why do people get up and wander around at night? They can't sleep. Why can't they sleep? Because they slept all day. Pretty straightforward. He's not an ancient man at this point. It's not like he's eating supper at 4 o'clock and watching People's Court and going to bed. Okay? We joke about that. I don't eat lunch a lot of times, so we eat an early supper, and I say, I got to take my back pill and then go to bed at 4 o'clock. so I can get up at midnight and wander around the house. No. David was spending his life in leisure. And consequently, he couldn't sleep at night. If he was working all day, when he went to bed, he would have been tired. My wife used to live in downtown Muskegon before we got married, and it always amazed me. Down there by Muskegon High School, you didn't see anybody all day long. But the minute it got dark, the streets were full of people walking here and there and everywhere. Now, I'm not going to be judged, well, maybe a little bit judgmental, okay? All right. I don't know that every single person that was walking around the streets at night was doing things that they weren't supposed to. But I do know this. If you're walking around the streets all night long, you can't be working a job during the daytime. You'd be too tired. This was part of David's problem. He was idle. My great-grandmother used to say, an idle mind is the devil's workshop, right? Or idle hands are the devil's handiwork, or something like that. But the point is, if you're not busy doing something good, you're going to be busy doing something bad. And David set himself up for trouble. He was self-confident, he was disobedient, he was idle, he was self-indulgent. David saw this woman taking a bath on a roof, and we talked about this a little bit in youth Sunday school class. Why on earth was she taking a bath on the roof? I mean, it's entire. You know what? There wasn't indoor plumbing, so somebody had to haul the water up there for her to be able to take a bath. I've never seen any evidence to suggest that this was the common practice for people to take baths on the roof. Maybe there was some special circumstance, and maybe they had a higher roof next door and the rainwater ran off it. I don't know. I don't know what the deal was. But it's pretty obvious that if she could see the king's window from her roof, then she would know the king could see her. Read between the lines here. It's very hard to believe that Bathsheba is an innocent victim in this circumstance. I'm married to Uriah. He's an officer in the king's army, which is a pretty important position, which gives me a pretty comfortable lifestyle. But you know what would be better than what I've got? Being queen. It's the next step up. And it would seem that she was complicit in David's plot to cover up her pregnancy. Where's it going? Self-indulgent. David looked, he saw this beautiful woman, and instead of looking, she didn't have to take a bath on the roof, but David didn't have to stare at her. Pure and simple. Guys, women do not have to wear revealing clothing. They don't. But you don't have to stare at them. Alright? That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Matter of fact, I am told that women today have the exact same problem. Used to be we only talk to guys about this, but it shows us how far our culture's gone. Ladies, guys don't have to wear revealing clothing. But you don't have to stare at them. You can say with Job, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look lustfully at a woman. Keep myself out of trouble. David was self-indulgent. He was careless. He was careless. All of these things should have been a huge red warning sign going off on his wall. Particularly this last one, self-indulgent. It should have been flashing. Warning, warning, danger, David, run away! And instead he said, I can play with this and it won't hurt me. Let me ask you this. What would happen to our church if it were discovered that the pastor was robbing banks? If somebody's chuckling, yeah, right. You can't run across the foyer, else you're going to rob a bank. All right? If that was splashed all over the paper, what would happen to the reputation of this church?
Downhill.
Crash and burn. What if it became known that you were robbing a marriage? Robbing a family? That you were taking away a wife or a mother that didn't belong to you? Taking away a father or a husband that did not belong to you? What would it do to the reputation of this church? What would it do to that family? What would it do to the reputation of our faith? And I'm not suggesting this morning that there isn't forgiveness, that there isn't healing. There is, but there's a whole lot of hurt before that. Recognize the warning signs and save yourself. Let's close in a word of prayer. Gracious Lord, thank you for this reminder today. My prayer is you would keep our church safe. Keep our people safe. Keep our families safe. And I pray that our marriages would be such that would honor and glorify you and give us great joy. We ask it all in Jesus' name.